Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. What is the role of science and scientists in the regenerative agriculture revolution, and why are there so few peer-reviewed papers on Regen Ag? Why does it seem like advanced regenerative farmers are doing things which are absolutely impossible according to traditional academia? In this interview, we dive deep into these topics and what to do about it. Welcome to another episode of Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, Investing as if the planet mattered, a podcast show where I talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities, and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land, grow our food, and what we eat. And it's time that we, as investors, big and small, and consumers, start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. In March last year, we launched our membership community to make it easy for fans to support our work. And so many of you have joined as a member. We've launched different types of benefits, exclusive content, Q&A webinars with former guests, Ask Me Anything sessions, plus so much more to come in the future. For more information on the different tiers, benefits, and how to become a member, check gumroad.com/investinregenag or find the link below. Thank you. Today on the podcast, we have an agroecologist, entomologist, farmer, and beekeeper. He's the director of non-profit Regenerative Agriculture Research Center, the ECDYSIS Foundation, cutting-edge research for transforming agriculture with regenerative principles, and the owner of Blue Dasher Farm in South Dakota. Welcome, Dr. Jonathan Lundgren.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well. And to ask you a personal question, why soil of all the things you could be doing?
You know, I never saw myself as a soil guy. In fact, I probably bucked against it for many, many years. I was an entomologist and I was supposed to focus on insects, and insects aren't soil. But it became real clear over time that all the soil scientists down the hallway from me at the USDA, everything that I was doing was being affected by them, and everything that they were doing was being affected by my study group. And it became clear that we're at a phase in agricultural science where these discipline-specific sorts of questions that have driven agricultural science for so long, I think that they're less relevant now. We need to figure out where all of our little sub-disciplines fit within the grander system. So entomology became agroecology. Who'd have thunk?
And then you left the USDA and you set up the foundation, you set up a farm. Can you describe a bit the different pieces there and how they interlink?
Yeah, so we have everything that the farmers were doing in this regenerative sphere was really spectacular. I mean, and they were doing things that science said couldn't happen, right?
Do you have an example?
Yeah, I mean, growing cover crops in arid regions or in areas with short growing seasons. They were going no-till where, oh no, if you do that, you're going to lose everything. They were diversifying their crop rotations. They were integrating animals into these systems. And it's like, every time we've done this scientific study on this research farm and everything was controlled, and it was like, we totally missed the boat. These farmers had developed systems that were very successful, but they were thinking about it as a system rather than a component research. Anyways, so I saw that this is the future of food production, right? So I tried to change the system from within the federal government. I was given an award by President Obama for being one of the top scientists in the country. Thought I had some political clout out there, thought I could make some changes. Big ships are hard to turn, and so I ended up quitting. I said, you know, this isn't going to come from the government. This isn't going to come from large universities. This is going to come from the grassroots, and it's already happening. And science, to support it, needs to come from the grassroots too. And we need to we need to rethink our food production systems, but we also need to rethink a lot of the associated aspects of society that accompany that change in our food system. And science is certainly one of those, and that's kind of what we're really interested in focusing on, is how we conduct agricultural science from this sort of paradigm shift perspective, macroevolutionary scale. is what we're talking about, not these little microevolutionary steps and incremental steps in science. So what we did is we created ECDYSIS Foundation, Blue Dasher Farm. We're revolutionizing how science is being done in order to drive a revolution in agriculture.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. You mentioned you believe Regen Ag is the future of food production. Do you remember, was there one specific moment that a light bulb moment? Was it over the years? You remember when that really clicked?
Well, just interacting with farmers and beekeepers. So ranchers, farmers, beekeepers, these guys were doing things that I had never seen before and that I was taught couldn't be done. They were growing traditional crops, but they didn't have insect pests. And so I said, well, what's your pest management regime? And they said, we don't have one. We don't have pests. And I said, no, that's not supposed to happen, right? Your pests are inevitable. You can't get away from these things. And they said, no, if you design your system right, you don't have these problems. And I'm like, okay. Seeing is believing just as much for scientists as it is for farmers, which is a real problem with our current scientific infrastructure, because how often do scientists actually go out to the field anymore? I went out to their operations. What they said was true. So guys like Gail Fuller and Gabe Brown, and more locally, even with farmers that were doing some spectacular things. For me, that was the turning point. It's like I can't go back to supporting a broken system like this anymore. I need to use my research and what skills I have for the future. And the future is regenerative ag.
And you decided to not only set up a foundation, but also a farm.
Yeah.
Can you explain a bit the work of the foundation of this macro revolution, you called it, and why there's a farm and a foundation? And what's your work, your focus currently in terms of getting the academic world to the regenerative agriculture world or the other way around?
Yeah, so what we said is one of the central problems is that we're evaluating scientists based on a cluster of metrics that separate us from the people that we're trying to help. Why do we feel success is related to whether or not you jump to mid-management level versus being in a cubicle for your whole career? What the hell does that mean? What a pointless thing, right? But it means something to you when you're in that system. And that's the same thing as what happened in science. I mean, we were evaluated based on how many scientific publications that you get in the peer-reviewed literature, which is great, but they're impenetrable to normal people that you're trying to help. How many grant dollars you've gotten, how many millions in competitive grants, how many students, graduate students, you pump through the puppy mill in order to turn them out.
And none of this is helping farmers, obviously.
On that list of things that we were assessing ourselves by, what do farmers care about? None of them, right? None of them. But the only way that you get a job in science is by adhering to that current bureaucracy. And so agricultural science is just in this self-perpetuating rut. We can't get out. And so the first step in the process is it's like, well, we've got some scientific credibility. We've worked within that system. We've demonstrated that we know it and are good at it. Now I'm going to quit and I'm going to start something totally different. And hopefully we can make some serious changes. So the first step in that process is that the scientists have to become farmers. We have to walk a mile in their shoes, because right now the scientific questions that we're asking that are supporting a broken agricultural system are too often they're completely disconnected from the kinds of questions that need to be answered from a practical perspective of farming.
So your farm is in South Dakota. Can you describe it a bit? What are you farming?
Well, what we did with Blue Dasher is we took the rule book, we looked at it, and then we threw it out the window.
The traditional rule book or the...
Right. At this point, it's small, but it's got a lot of enterprises stacked on top of each other. And that's what I think our regenerative farm is supposed to do, is have those enterprises integrated vertically. So what do? We raise sheep, we raise honey, we raise prairie, we raise wetlands, we raise chickens for meat and egg production. We're looking at other forms of meat production here that we can integrate in. We have an orchard for perennial fruit production, fruit and nut. And then we also have both annual and perennial field crops that are kind of all integrated in with a native unbroken prairie. which if your listeners have never experienced the prairie that used to range across North America, it's a real gem. And there isn't many little pockets like Blue Dasher Farm left anymore, less than 1%.
Wow. And then how does it connect to the academic? Because you could have just started, just between brackets, obviously, you could have just started a farm and say, okay, I've seen the experience of many of the farmers. It seems to make a lot of sense. I put my academic hat on the wall and that's it. And I will just become a farmer and step away from the academic world. But you didn't.
Right. And there's a lot of days, sometimes I wish I could pick one hat to wear, but I don't. So the research facility is right here on Blue Dasher Farm, and we have a scientific staff that's located here. This is the first in what it's becoming a national network of these centers for regenerative agriculture research.
Wow.
So we're looking at expanding into Colorado and California in the next year, maybe Iowa, and just starting to extend our reach. But the whole idea...
Because that's something that's missing.
Yeah. Well, what we would like these to be is sort of the scientists have to become a part of the agricultural community again, not in some ivory tower, but actually a place of learning where people can go and be a part of it. And then we can also be a part of that community where we get to know the farmers in our region and help them directly with their problems.
And what are some of the problems you've been tackling at the farm?
How to manage vegetation without tillage or agrochemicals. So we're farming our annual crops directly into perennial warm season grasses, which is, again, one of those rules that we threw out the window. And now we have to figure out, okay, why do we do what we do and how do we make it work? So we're using tools that are really well adapted to our environment, which are fire and grazing, and of course, vegetation competition in order to control vegetation, not eradicate it, which is often the goal of vegetation management, but rather how do we push it down at key points to allow us to take our revenue earning crop off of the field.
And you mentioned it was small, the farm. What's the size? What should we imagine as listeners?
53 acres, but half of that is unbroken prairie and wetlands, and we're working with those.
As an integrated system.
Yeah, right.
And in terms of research, to bring it up, you published a number of papers, or you published a paper where we connected over in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, focused on the profitability of regenerative farmers versus non-regenerative farmers, which is one of the few studies I know that actually came up. Please let me know in the comments if you know of any others that really connected that profitability, which obviously all investors, but also all farmers always talk about. Can you describe a bit the background of that study and then we get into the results?
Well, we received a research grant to study cover crops and their effects on insects. It was meant to be an on-farm study. So we went out and we talked with some of these regenerative farmers. I don't know that they knew they were regenerative farmers at the time because that word really wasn't floating around much in the U.S. yet.
How did they call themselves? Soil farmers? How did you connect it?
I don't know. I don't know. They were no-tillers, cover croppers, that kind of stuff. But regen really became a thing, and people rallied behind that term for sure. Anyway, so we said, okay, you guys are the leaders. We want to learn from you. You guys have an amazing farm in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Nebraska, which is kind of the heart of this transition zone between corn, soybean land and rangelands. And they said, yeah, we want to participate. And so we said, okay, great. Well, we're the scientists, and so we're going to come out there. What you want to do then, if you're going to participate, is you're going to plant this cover crop at this particular time, and you're going to have 4 replicated plots, and then you're going to leave half of those without them.
I would have loved to see their faces.
And they're like, what the hell is this? What are you talking about? We don't use Roundup. We can't use that. What species of cover crop are you talking about? I mean, do you want us to, and when do you want us to sow that? And I'm like, okay, this is a cluster. This is a total nightmare. It's falling apart. But what was really falling apart is that those guys were leading this cover crop charge at the time, and we were losing what was special about their farm. And so that's when I changed the whole focus of our research program. It's like, what we're doing is wrong. We're losing what's special about these farmers, and these farmers are the actual leaders, not the scientists. And so what we said, farmer, point us to the corn phase of your rotation, and we'd like to study that. And they said, okay, that's no trouble. And then we said, okay, point us to the corn phase of your neighbor who's a conventional farmer who's been successful at that conventional farming. They said, no problem. And so we went and we studied those. And we got a totally different picture of anything that anybody's ever demonstrated within, I think, the peer-reviewed literature. We got a systems level study with best management practices that were defined by successful farming operations as opposed to what scientists have defined as best management practices in a laboratory, or on a research farm. And then it's got a regional focus instead of just one little pocket. So that model of study is kind of a part of this whole idea of how it is that we approach agricultural science, where we need to be considering these systems, and how do you define those systems also becomes a real challenge because it's not traditionally done very well. Everything has to be very controlled. So we're losing the relevance by controlling everything in their scientific questions.
And we're going to unpack that piece a bit, but what were a few of the outcomes that I would say, what surprised you the most? I mean, you've seen a lot of things prior to that study. What would be a few of the big surprises coming out of, apart from the fact that you had to change your whole setup of your study, but that was probably a humbling experience.
Right, yeah. The number one, insect pests were 10 times more abundant in the insecticide-treated cornfields. That wasn't supposed to happen.
No, because they were treated, yeah.
Right. That's why we buy this stuff. It's a good investment, right?
10 times, not even 10% or 10-fold. More abundant of insecticide. Wow.
I mean, similar numbers in other cropping systems now. It's just like, it's a total fallacy. Everything that we learned about integrated pest management, it was doomed to fail from the beginning. When it was conceived back in 1959, it was doomed to fail because what it said was, what into IPM, which is the way that people apply pesticides and things like that, they said, here's a broken system that's going to have pests, and here's how to manage them better. And what they should have been asking is, why are there pests to begin with? And that's what these farmers did on these regenerative cornfields. Another thing that was pretty surprising is that the yields were uncorrelated with profit. And this is something that we've been suspecting for quite some time. Farmers don't have a business plan. There's no business plan on most farms in the U.S.
No, they only talk about yield.
They only talk about yield.
I mean, the regenerative guys and girls definitely talk about margins and profits, etc., because they're comfortable with that.
Yeah.
But it always surprised me as somebody that doesn't come from farming. Like, you would never ask that question. I've probably said it a million times on this podcast, to a factory. Like, what's the maximum you can squeeze out of in terms of bicycles or in terms of phones? No, you would ask, what's the optimal in terms of costs, input, output, to see. I mean, you're not going to do 24-hour shifts if it doesn't make sense, or you're not going to input, etc. But somehow in farms, we only ask, what's your yield? That's it.
Yeah, it's crazy. And down at the coffee shop too. I mean, nobody's talking about.
Of course, yeah, that's the one thing we compare. Yeah, mm-hmm. But they weren't correlated. So what's going on there?
Well, what my conclusion is, I mean, you can grow 300 bushel corn if you really want to, but it's going to take a lot of input costs. And that's not good farming, right? It's really poor farming, but you still have the best yields in the county. And that's what matters to the farmer. Again, what metrics are we assessing our success by within these different fields?
Yeah, it said something like the regenerative fields, and I would like to touch upon that a bit later, had a 29% lower grain production, but 78% higher profits over traditional corn production systems. So that's, again, significant, a lot, etc. But at 29%, because I hear some people now saying we're actually approaching, like, we're outperforming, approaching, even if you just look at corn, etc., on some regenerative fields. Do you see that too? Is this because we looked at part of the system and not at the holistic? Like, does this include the grazing that they might do afterwards as well? How should we look at the 29 and not be scared? Okay, like it's almost 30% less. How are we going to feed the world? Which is something we hear all the time, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, right now, 67%, I think, something like this, of the arable land in North America is devoted to crops we don't eat. So if you want to feed the world, grow food. let's pretty simple. Number two, hunger is not correlated to how much corn we're producing. If there's hunger issues around the world, it's either a distribution problem or we're producing the wrong kinds of thing.
So you're saying the 29% less is not something to be frightened about or to go into some kind of like, oh.
No. And then the last thing on that is some of the top yielding farms in this study were the regenerative farms.
So it's possible. It doesn't have to be, but that's not their metric of what they're optimizing for, or they should.
I think that's true. I mean, they're focusing on the profitability of their operation. But it's also true that we're on the front edge of a movement right now, and there's a lot more variability in yields and production.
Because how many farmers were there in that study?
20 or something like that. I'd have to go back and think about it. But yeah, about 20.
But not 200. Like it's definitely...
Right.
And it was one of the first studies, and it's still the only one I've seen at this level, at this system level. You were mentioning you're working on some others. Can you share a bit on that?
Yeah, so our strategy at ECDYSIS is, we're trying to change the world to regenerative food production using science as much as we can. And part of our strategy is to find key systems, food systems around the country that can have knock-on benefits or affect sort of agricultural communities. And so we're working, we did the corn study that you were referring to. We're working in rangelands in the southeastern U.S. and rangelands up in the northern plains of the U.S. and Canada. We're working on cash grain systems from Manitoba all the way down to Kansas.
And how did you pick those? Because they're large acreage, because huge issues? What's the framework to decide?
So we look at what are some of the dominant crops that can either profit-wise or acres-wise in a particular region. And then the hope is that when we turn that crop, that the rest of the rest kind of sees that.
And when you say region, is that bioregional, watershed? What's the...
Ecoregions, I guess. So the goal is we divided the U.S. into a certain number of these ecoregions based on climate, based on rainfall, temperature, and then growing conditions, more or less. And then markets, but they probably drive a lot of those as well. Almonds in California would be another example. And that one we're just wrapping up.
That would be interesting. And that's coming?
Yeah, so that one's going to change California agriculture, fundamentally change it. And agriculture in California it's one of the biggest agricultural states in the U.S. in terms of financially. So.
And probably the world by itself, yeah.
I'll bet you're right, yeah.
Yeah, no, in terms of economy, it's the 7th in the world if it would be a separate country. So
is that right? Yeah.
In terms of agriculture, it would be, I wouldn't know, somewhere around the 10th maybe. And it's, if you drive through California, you see the negative impact mostly of what agriculture has been, especially if you read the earliest descriptions of how California used to be, or used to look when the first European settlers came in, what kind of abundance there was. Obviously as a managed system, because the landscape have been managed, but you can see how quickly that has turned into pretty much a desert.
It's a desert now, and water is becoming a really central issue that only regenerative ag can solve, right?
More pipes. No. I saw the signs. I was driving through California in October, and you can see the desert and the water, and it's quite depressing, honestly. It
was a real eye-opener for me. We work a lot on bees, honeybees, and most of the nation's bees, during the summertime, they live up by us, right? And then during the early in the year, we ship most of the nation's bees out to California to pollinate tree crops, especially almonds. So anything that I'm doing to try to save the bees up in South Dakota is completely negated when they get hosed down by every agrochemical under the sun in California.
It's a miracle they still come back sort of alive when they come back to you after the...
No, they don't, actually. No, they don't. That's the problem, is that they don't. Sometimes they're dead hives walking, but they're dead.
Wow.
And so it became real clear that we need to start working on agriculture out in California.
And you're saying this study is going to change Californian agriculture?
Right.
Without giving away too much, how do you see that happening? Why would you say that?
It was a very similar study design to what we did in rangelands and what we did in the corn study and what we're doing in cash grain systems. We just found the most progressive regenerative almond producers, and there wasn't many, but we found them, and then we did a fence line comparison with conventional almond producers right nearby or even literally right across the path from the regenerative guys. And the regenerative guys are implementing things like perennial ground covers and diversity, plant diversity. They're abandoning all agrochemical use. They are increasing compost teas, and then they're integrating animals back into their orchards. We found 6 times higher biodiversity in the regenerative almond orchards.
And by biodiversity, what do you mean?
Primarily insect life in terms of
6 times.
6 times the life. I mean, when we talk about the insect apocalypse and the biodiversity losses the planet is facing right now, that's huge. That's money in the bank. Every one of those insects is worth revenue.
Yeah.
We don't know how to value it yet, but it is. And it shows in the profitability of the farm system. Soil organic matter is 30% higher. So carbon sequestration was higher in these almond orchards.
Wow.
That's a huge, when we're talking about sort of incentivizing carbon sequestration models and things like that.
Water use, probably a lot lower.
Water infiltration rates was 6 times higher in the regenerative almonds. Wow. And that will change California ag.
Yeah, because now it's like concrete underneath the trees. Yeah.
Not only that, but there's no water to be had or very little water to be had, especially in certain regions, and they're planning on taxing what they have.
So whenever it comes from the sky, you should hold on it as long as you can, which means infiltration.
Yeah.
But then go the yields, because that's key as well.
Yeah, so at this point, I mean, with the data, we haven't analyzed everything yet, but it looks like yields are about equivalent in the two systems. Profit was twice as high.
Profit twice as high. Flavor? I mean, you must have tried them.
We have nutrient density that we're still running, and then we'll also have, taste comparisons and things like that.
What are you using for the nutrient density?
So we are thinking about nutrient density a little bit differently. We've thought a lot about this over the last few years about how to measure this, and we're coming at this from an ecological perspective. Mm-hmm. So right now, everybody's like, oh, it's density, density, density. It's like, density of what? I mean, what are we looking for here? Because within the ecological sphere, we're not interested in density. If you have too much density of one particular nutrient, it's called a pest, or one particular insect or something.
So you're looking at an overview or the right composition.
So what we're interested is using diversity indices for assessing nutrient diversity and nutrient content of these different foods. And so we're applying similar ecological principles to looking at the relative abundance and the number of different nutrients that are available within these different foods. And then we can generate indices that are based on that. Ultimately, we're going to have to evaluate which of these indices are best correlated with our response variables, which is, at the end of the day, human health, right?
And your microbiome.
Yeah, right. Those are 50-year studies, right?
Yeah. What can you absorb? It's great if how are you measuring the nutrient availability and thus also partly density? What are you using currently to figure that out in these almonds?
We're using very inexpensive soil analyses or plant nutrient forage quality things. That gives us a huge range of micronutrients for very inexpensive. The farmers can do themselves. They are doing it themselves. They're just not using it for this. And then we're taking that information and generating indices that then we can compare with, hopefully some things that are meaningful to the customers.
And what are some differences you see to the regenerative grown almonds and the neighbor?
We don't know yet.
Okay.
The study is still steaming. It's so hot, it's still steaming. We're still working on it.
And to describe because for anybody that didn't have the chance to travel in California, how would you describe a bit visually, obviously, as we are on a podcast, the difference between the neighbor and a regenerative farm? Like, how does an orchard look like? If you stand and you have that fence that you normally have or a road and you see left and right, what's the visual differences that you can see, basically, the difference between regen and almond?
To the right is your conventional almond orchard, and it's absolutely sterile. There's dust. It's grown in dust. It's not soil anymore. And the only thing that's growing are almond trees. The almond trees themselves are probably yielding as much as we think that a conventional orchard can yield. based on chemotherapy that's keeping these trees alive, but it's a sterile environment. And then right across the path to your left is a regenerative almond orchard, and under the ground it feels cool because the plant cover, there's 10, 15, 20 species of plants growing underneath it. There's life in that orchard, and it feels alive.
It's a place you want to be.
Yep, that's right. That's exactly it.
Thanks for that. I hope everybody could travel a bit to, especially as we're in a period where we're not allowed to travel at all, to travel to a regenerative versus non-regenerative one.
Yeah.
So when is this study, it's steaming hot. When is it coming out, or when is it scheduled to be out?
This is work that was done by Tommy Fenster, and he's getting his master's degree with this study. He's writing his thesis right now, and we'll be submitting those papers for publication in open access journals over the next probably 6 months or so.
Okay. So this year we'll be able to see the shock. Yeah.
My hope is that there'll be 2020 papers. Yeah. We really need to get this out.
Yeah. So this is another rabbit hole probably. What do you see the role of science in regen ag, ideally?
In a supportive role. Scientists need to be students again. We need to learn from the experts and take that knowledge to help to validate what they're doing. Because right now within regenerative ag, and it becomes very difficult for investors to think about this because it's all anecdotes, right? It's like, oh,
where are the peer-reviewed papers?
So-and-so, he did great things, but there's no data behind it, right? And there's no instance of, yes, it worked on that particular farm, but is it going to work someplace else? And so science can help with that. And that's what we've been using our science for. The other way that we're using science to help fuel this revolution is to help provide scientifically proven roadmaps for transition. Because right now there's a lot of early adopters in this, but that's not the majority of farmers. And we need to make it as simple and transparent for those farmers to transition their operations towards a regenerative model so that we can remove some of the risk that's associated with that.
And the fear and the uncertainty. So what would a roadmap look like?
So yes, again, this is rethinking how we do agricultural science. So our strategy is, you know what? It's so funny because I've had developed this plan for almonds now, and we're doing this in cash grain systems for General Mills. They're trying to transition their supply chain to a regenerative one.
Yeah, I had Mary Jane on the podcast. I would say a year ago, but I'm probably getting the date wrong. Yeah.
Anyways, we're doing some of the science behind the biodiversity assessments for them to help with that. Anyways, so I was just asked to provide what's next for the almonds. I'm like, well, we're going to do this transition. And so I had to write up what exactly experiments are we doing. And so I'm like, okay, well, I think we're going to have these treatments, right? We need to have treatments, and we're going to do this, and we're going to have cover crops here, but maybe we need to only allow certain cover crops. And then maybe we'll have another treatment where they're integrating animals, but I wonder which species it should. And I'm like, holy cow. I just went back in time to the corn study again.
It's like the other study, yeah.
And I'm like, what am I doing here? And so I stepped.
It's a reflex.
Yep, that's what I was trained to do, control everything. And so what our strategy is yes, we can provide some guidelines, but what we're doing is the farmers are going to be transitioning. There's going to be a lot based on this almond study right off of the bat. A lot of our control orchards, or some of the control orchards, are already transitioning. So it's like, well, we can't use those guys again.
Because they see the neighbors. I mean, you just described it visually as a place you want to be versus a place of you don't want to be. And then they hear the profitability. And I think a lot of them would jump on it. Obviously, it's not so easy and you're stuck in a system we all created. But you're saying that many are starting to move.
And just as a story, we had one of our conventional orchardists come over to the regenerative guy, and we were sitting at the table and we showed him the data just on the pests, right? And he looked at the data and he's like, I don't believe this. I don't believe it. What you're telling me is that I did everything right. I mean, I followed the university's recommendations. I sprayed 5 times last year. I sprayed insecticides. And I have the same number of pests as my neighbors who didn't spray at all. I don't believe it. I don't believe what you're telling me. But that guy just transitioned, or has just started to transition 125 acres of almonds over to regenerative this year.
That's a lot of insecticides.
That's a lot of insecticides.
And a lot of insects that we need, yeah.
Tens of thousands of dollars per year. That's another position. That's keeping a son on the farm or a daughter on the farm kind of money,
Wow. That's very interesting. So what made him, I'm assuming it's a him, that's also interesting, but that's for another discussion. What made him, let's say it's him, from I'm not believing this data, and he could have thrown it out and just ignored it. What made him make that step?
I think it was the science. I think it was.
So it was a reflex of saying, I don't believe this. And then,
I think it was. Initially he's like, he had to throw everything out that he thought was right.
He's been fooled.
He had been fooled.
And lied to for a long time.
Yeah. By the scientists, by the industry, by everybody. And I'm not saying that was an intentional,
No, but it's
anybody. Well, some people it probably was, but
now we know better, or we should know. And that's, we were discussing internet before. We're in a different world compared to 40 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. Daily farmers find your study, find your TEDx talk, go online, find other people, find people even nearby in some cases that are, they threw out the rule book and started from zero.
Yeah, that's crazy. And that's where no strings attached research also comes into play, and that credibility.
Can you describe that a bit for the listeners? Where's your funding coming from? What's the model? Because otherwise, if you are connected to the old system of academia, etc., you have strings attached.
Right. So one of the first things that we did is that, science is all of the studies out of these large institutions are being strongly influenced by where the revenue is coming in from. And the revenue is coming in from, in agricultural sciences, from large seed companies, from large chemical companies. They even have, the naming rights on the buildings, for crying out loud. It's like, it's crazy in the US right now. And so we said,
no.
Anybody on the production side, we're not interested in taking their money. So our revenue comes from competitive grants, and it comes from donations. It comes from education. So when we give presentations or workshops or things like that, we ask farmers pay for their education. And then from farm revenue. So we kind of have to walk the talk. We've been faced with this issue of large food companies and things like that approaching us because they want
a General Mills,
for example, but others have as well.
And how do you deal with that, with the potential criticism of, but you're connecting to these giants and don't dance with the devil, etc.?
It's really challenging for us because our integrity and our credibility are paramount. I'll go broke before I sell out. I'm not willing to sacrifice that on a personal level. And I dealt with that at the USDA in a major way.
Just for anybody listening, that's a whole different interview we can do. You can definitely Google, you'll find a lot on that, but we're not going to dive into that now.
Sure. So if I don't have a firm rubric yet, I go by, does the company actually invest in this? Are they committed to this? And if they are, we want to help them in some way. So if it's a multi-billion-dollar food company and they're dumping, $4 million into regenerative ag for their beef production or something like that, BS, right? I'm not buying that.
Regenerative washing. Yeah.
Right, that's what it is. But for other companies that want to change their supply chain and they're working with farmers already and a demonstrated interest, to me, I feel more comfortable with that. If Monsanto walked in tomorrow and said, we're really committed to this whole regenerative ag thing, it'd be like, here's the door.
To the soil. Yeah.
Here's the door. Yeah, we're committed to soil. Right.
And in terms of, if you can share, just to have an idea, what does a study like the grain study you did in 2018, what does it cost? Just to have an understanding of the budgets needed to do things like this. Is it $1 million? Is it 10 million? Is it 200,000? What's more or less the range, if you can give a range, obviously?
Can we do a study on a shoestring? Yes.
Do you want to? No.
We can't. We're at the scale now. So for the cash grain system, for a 3-year project, it's probably going to run 1.5 million for the 3-year transition study on almonds, and that accompanies an additional validation in the southern range of almond production. That's going to be 1.1 million is what we're thinking about.
So manageable, yeah. Nothing, I mean, it's a lot of money for anybody listening. It's not that I don't have it on my bank account, but it's compared to any research budgets, it's really a drop in the bucket.
It's a drop in the bucket for the potential benefit.
And with a huge potential impact, yeah.
Oh my God. I mean, look at almond.
How many hectares of almonds or acres of almonds, is there just in California?
Oh God, I'd have to look that up. It's the dominant. That and rangeland are the dominant agricultural.
The dominance, yeah.
Yeah, vineyards have quite a bit of acreage, but almonds trumps it by a long shot. One soybean farmer, I mean, we did a neonic study that showed that neonicotinoids, that's an insecticidal seed treatment. It's on a lot of crop seeds.
So basically, just for anybody that thinks, what is he talking about? What does that do in practice if I'm a farmer?
Doesn't do anything, actually, and that's the problem.
What should it? How do you use it? Let's rephrase.
It's supposed to go out there to help control insect pests on your crop.
So it's basically, it's like you dip the seed in it.
Yeah.
It's like a seed coating. Oh.
Yeah. Anyway, so we did some studies and showed it doesn't work. And so I told some farmers that, and they were like, so we stopped using neonics this last year based on your study. You saved us $10,000 last year.
In 1 year.
1 year. I mean, that's one operation, 1 year. I think, yeah, the potential impact of the financial side of things is just astounding. So almonds, if we can double the profitability of oh my God, the millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that would come out of that for
billions of insects that suddenly
annually, yeah,
were sprayed down. And maybe some of your bees come back actually alive. That would be
right, exactly. Oh, knock-on benefits for the community. I mean, the health services, all of these different elements of society that would benefit from just changing, climate change, for crying out loud. Pretty profound. It's a drop in the bucket.
Absolutely. In terms of leverage and potential impact, it's enormous. Just to shift gears a bit, because I want to be conscious of your time, I'd like to end with a few final questions. What would you do if you would be in charge of a $1 billion investment portfolio tomorrow morning? Like you wake up and you had $1 billion to invest, which could be partly philanthropy, partly investing. I mean, it's your portfolio. How would you approach that?
$1 billion is a lot of money, isn't it?
That's why I asked the question. Yeah.
Hard to think of that scale. Well, certainly from our perspective, and we're thinking about changing the world through science. And so I'd like some of that to be devoted to creating this national or even international network of how we conduct agricultural research from a paradigm shift. And we have that entirely laid out. The whole business plan is already thought through. So it's one of those things that's just waiting for $1 billion.
So that would be 200-300 million. What would be the range?
Probably so. Yeah, I'll bet that's about what it would take, at least on a
initial, but then it would pay for itself.
Yeah. So that's where I would put it, and rethinking our entire scientific infrastructure around agriculture and investing into that, because the knock-on benefits of that would fuel society's health and vigor for the next 5-10 generations. What a great investment, use of money.
And then if you could, I mean, we're taking off your investor hat. Unfortunately, the fund didn't work out. But if you could change one little thing, or one big thing actually, in the agriculture industry from a sustainability point of view, what would it be? If you could wave a magic wand and one thing would change, what would it be?
Golly, I mean, that's a difficult question. I mean, that's kind of, what would I do? What does the food system of the future look like in 50 years? No more agricultural subsidies except for disasters, making farms businessmen again.
That could change overnight with your magic wand.
Yeah, it sure could. Creating this model that we're trying to create for helping integrating these rural communities again. Farming smaller and smarter instead of larger and simpler.
Why do you say integrating the communities again? Because they have been completely disintegrated.
Right. Rural communities in the U.S. are the basis of our entire economy. Whether we like to think about that or not, it's absolutely true.
I think in many places we don't like to think about it, but I would argue most of Europe, unless rural economies, does agriculture, because that's pretty much the same thing. Unless we get that to work, all the rest is sort of...
It's just a foundation, right? I mean, it's the foundation of everything.
Which we now figure out as we suddenly all scramble to figure out who do we know that grows food.
Yep.
We see an empty shelf for the first time in our lives in the supermarket.
Yep.
For many people, I'm not saying, I mean, obviously if you're calling in or listening in other countries, that might be something you see often, but here absolutely not.
Yeah.
And suddenly like who has chickens and who has that and who has a big vegetable garden, etc.
We're learning the fallibility of that industrialized food system right now. It's pretty astounding. And this is why, I mean, for this crisis is exactly why we founded Blue Dasher Farm and ECDYSIS Foundation. Was this crisis was coming. We saw it coming for the last 10 years at least, and we needed to be here and ready. And now that it's here, we're kind of like scrambling. It's like, all right, get the information out there. We got to, all right, start putting out these fires. It's kind of, yeah, it's escalated, that's for sure. Does that answer your question?
It does.
At least gets us more dialogue.
I mean, subsidies come up very often in these final questions, if something could disappear, or animals outside, or something like that.
Yeah. You know what we need to do, what I would do if I had a magic wand, and we've been talking about this in the lab with the scientific team quite a bit, forcing everybody to take off their shoes and walk around outside and feel the connection. You know, winter's long in South Dakota. I don't know if you've ever been here, but it's long in South Dakota. And me and my partner, Christina, were walking out on the prairie, and I've been so stressed out with Corona and how am I going to keep ECDYSIS afloat and all of these different ideas, and this research has to come out now, and the farm is starting to wake up. And I went out to the prairie and we looked at the earliest flower is called the pasque flower, and it's just beautiful on the prairie. And I laid down in the prairie and I just looked at that and I felt everything melt away. That connection with the natural world is a part of us, and it's so fundamental and spiritual and emotional and physical, and everything is connected to it. And we are missing that as a species right now too often. So if I had a magic wand, that's my answer. That's what I pick.
Go out, take off your shoes on a lively farm, let's say, on a live farm, because otherwise you'll burn your feet.
Yep.
I think it's a perfect place to end this conversation. I hope it's not the last time we connect. I definitely will be checking in on all the research you're doing and publishing. Okay. And thank you so much for your time today, John. And it's been a pleasure.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, spread the word. If you want to see more of this kind of science, think about supporting it, and sure to appreciate the time.
I will link everything below. Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Thank you so much. If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, if this podcast has been of value to you, and if you have the means, please join my Patreon community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on patreon.com/regenerative agriculture or in the description below. Thank you so much, and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? What questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space? For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, ag tech companies, farm to gut food companies, permaculture key line designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're going to look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soy builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.